Come closer. You've been feeling it too, haven't you? That tiny tremor beneath the surface of everything, that whisper that things aren't quite as solid as they seem. It starts small, a barely noticeable crack in the everyday. But it grows, it spreads, and it devours not just things, but the very idea of them being connected. Before we dive into the true terror, make sure you join us in the shadows. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single nightmare we unravel together, because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and it's already begun. Our story begins with Aris Thorne, a name that sounds as sharp and precise as the person it belongs to. Aris was a forensic anthropologist, a master of fragments. Bones, pottery, ancient tools, give them a shattered piece, and Aris would find its place, rebuild the whole. It was their gift, their passion, their desperate need. Aris saw the world as a vast, complex puzzle. Every piece had its partner, every event its cause. Chaos was the enemy, order the salvation. And they were very, very good at finding order, even in the most broken things. This drive defined them, both professionally and personally. They had come to Oakhaven, a town tucked away deep in the mountains, almost forgotten by the world. The reason? A newly unearthed set of ancient ruins promising a rich tapestry of history, just waiting to be pieced back together. A perfect challenge for Aris Thorne. Oakhaven itself was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, not peaceful. The few locals Aris saw seemed to move with a strange, almost hesitant rhythm, like dancers who had forgotten their steps but kept trying anyway. Aris's temporary cabin was small, nestled on the outskirts of town near the dig site. It was simple, functional, a place to sleep, to study, to escape the world's noise. But even here, in this sanctuary of order, the first tremor began. On their first morning making coffee, Aris noticed it. The sugar bowl. It sat on the counter, perfectly centered as it should be, but somehow it felt wrong, as if it wasn't quite resting on the surface, but merely floating above it by a hair's breadth. Aris blinked, rubbed their eyes. The bowl was flush. Of course it was. It was just tiredness, the long drive, the new surroundings, a trick of the light. Their mind, always seeking order, dismissed it as quickly as it appeared. But the feeling lingered, a faint echo of something being misaligned, a tiny discord in the symphony of the ordinary. Aris, ever meticulous, made a mental note, not a problem, just an observation. Over the next few days, these small observations piled up. A book on a shelf, its spine facing slightly the wrong way, as if someone had placed it without truly seeing it. A fork in a drawer, lying not with its brethren, but angled away, alone. These were trivial things, easily explained. Human error. Aris told themselves this, but the explanations felt thin, like tissue paper over a growing void. These things weren't just misplaced. They felt disconnected. Then came the people of Oakhaven. Aris tried to engage, to learn about the town, but conversations felt strange. People would speak, but their words didn't quite flow. Like a sentence made of individual words, each one a separate island. A simple question about the weather might be answered with a pause, a blank look, then a reply that seemed to come from nowhere, unrelated. As if the question and answer were two separate events, happening in parallel, but never quite meeting. Aris, always observing, noted the subtle social awkwardness. People didn't quite make eye contact. Their gestures were stiff, uncoordinated. It was like watching a play where the actors had forgotten their cues but were still trying to perform. One evening at the town's only diner, Aris overheard a conversation, or rather, a series of monologues. Two men sitting at the same table, speaking about entirely different things, occasionally nodding as if they understood, but clearly not. It was unsettling, not openly hostile, not rude, just fundamentally fragmented, as if the very idea of shared understanding, of common ground, was slipping away. Aris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. The dig site was where Aris truly felt at home. The dust, the tools, the promise of history. Here, at least, things had a past, a structure, or so they hoped. They began with the most promising finds, shards of ancient pottery. Each piece was carefully cleaned, catalogued, examined. Aris's hands, so skilled, moved with practiced ease. This was their element. This was where order was restored. But the first attempts at reassembly were met with a baffling resistance. Two pieces clearly meant to fit would not. Not that they were the wrong shape or chipped. They just refused, like magnets repelling each other, but without any visible force. A hairline gap remained, a tiny, impossible void. Aris tried again and again, adjusting angles, applying gentle pressure. Nothing. The pieces, though clearly from the same vessel, remained stubbornly separate. It was as if the very concept of fitting together had been subtly altered just for these fragments. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an affront to Aris's skill, to their understanding of reality. How could two things that were asterisk meant asterisk to connect? Simply not. It defied logic, defied physics, defied everything Aris believed. The unsettling feeling from the sugar bowl, from the townspeople's conversations, now coalesced into a growing dread. This wasn't just Oakhaven. This was something fundamental. Something was wrong with the very fabric of connection itself. Aris began to see it everywhere. The ancient stones of the ruins, meant to interlock, now had tiny, unfillable gaps between them, not erosion, but a subtle, unnatural severance. The world was subtly coming apart at the seams. The not quite right feeling intensified. It wasn't just objects, it was memories. Aris would try to recall a specific detail from a conversation, and the memory would be there, but somehow isolated. The context, the surrounding words, simply gone. It was like remembering a single word, but forgetting the sentence it belonged to, or a single face, but forgetting who they were or why they mattered. The connections, the relationships, were being devoured, leaving behind only fragments. One afternoon, at the local library, a small, dusty room with more cobwebs than books, Aris overheard two elderly women whispering. Their voices were low, hushed, speaking of old tales. The spaces between things, one woman murmured, her voice thin as old paper. They grow, and they take what is known, what connects. The other woman nodded slowly, her eyes wide and distant. The loom, she whispered back, it unravels. It eats the threads that hold us, holds everything together. Aris froze. The unraveling loom, the spaces between things. It echoed the horrifying reality they were experiencing. This wasn't just a local superstition. It was a description of the insidious horror taking root. The conversation faded, replaced by the creak of old wood and the oppressive silence. Aris felt a cold dread settle deep in their bones. This wasn't some isolated anomaly. It was a pervasive force, actively devouring the very concept of connection. Back at the dig site, Aris worked with a frantic energy, trying to prove the whispers wrong, trying to force the pieces together. But the ancient fragments mocked them, each gap a confirmation of the horror. The ruins themselves seemed to shift, not physically, but in perception. A wall that seemed solid one moment would appear to have tiny, almost invisible fissures the next, like a photograph slowly dissolving. Aris's sleep became restless, filled with dreams of disconnected limbs and floating, meaningless words. They would wake in a cold sweat, the cabin feeling vast and empty, the silence heavier than ever before. The need for order, for connection that had always driven Aris, now became a desperate, gnawing hunger. They had to find the truth. They had to prove that even the most shattered remnants could be reconnected. Otherwise, what was left? One rainy afternoon, while exploring a rarely used storage shed near the dig site, Aris stumbled upon an old, leather-bound journal. It was tucked away, almost hidden, beneath a pile of dusty tarps. The journal was brittle, its pages yellowed. The handwriting was neat at first, then grew increasingly erratic. It belonged to a Dr. Elias Vance, a researcher who had come to Oakhaven years ago, studying the same ruins. Aris's heart pounded. A predecessor, someone else who had been here, seen these ruins. Perhaps they had found the answers, or perhaps they had found the horror. The journal began with scientific observations, detailed notes on the artifacts. But soon, the entries shifted. Dr. Vance began to describe the same subtle misalignments, the same fragmented conversations. His initial dismissals slowly gave way to confusion, then to fear. He wrote of the pottery shards that wouldn't connect, the stones that wouldn't lock. He described the growing sense of isolation, the feeling that his own thoughts were breaking apart, losing their narrative thread. Dr. Vance's entries became shorter, more desperate. He spoke of the void in the spaces, of the hunger that devours meaning. His sanity was clearly unraveling, just like the world around him. Aris read faster, a terrible premonition gripping them. The journal was not a solution, it was a mirror, a chilling reflection of their own escalating nightmare. The doctor's observations were their own, but taken to a terrifying extreme. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled, fragmented, almost incoherent. It was dated many years ago. It spoke of a final, horrifying realization, a truth too terrible to bear. Aris strained to decipher the last few lines, their breath catching in their throat. The words seemed to float on the page, disconnected, almost meaningless. But then a phrase emerged, stark and cold. "The gaps are not empty," it read, the ink smeared as if the pen had slipped. "They are hungry, and they are watching." Aris dropped the journal. It fell with a soft thud onto the dusty floor. The silence in the shed pressed in, suddenly filled with an unseen presence. The gaps, the void, they were not passive absences. They were sentient, predatory. The words echoed the local legend of the Unraveling Loom, the entity that devoured connection. It wasn't just breaking things apart, it was actively consuming the very glue that held reality together. And it was here, in Oakhaven. Aris looked around the dusty shed. The tools on the shelves, the stacks of crates, the very walls themselves, they all seemed to pulse with tiny, almost invisible fissures. Gaps, hungry gaps, watching. The forensic anthropologist, who lived to connect, to rebuild, to find order in the shattered, now faced a horror that actively devoured connection, leaving only isolated, meaningless fragments. And it was just beginning to truly show itself. What happens when the very fabric of existence unravels? When your memories become islands, your loved ones strangers, and your world a collage of meaningless, unlinked elements? What happens when the spaces between things become the monsters themselves? We're about to find out. The journal lay open on the dusty floor of the shed. Dr. Vance's final, frantic words echoed in Aris's mind. The gaps are not empty, they are hungry, and they are watching. The air in the shed suddenly felt thick, heavy, as if unseen eyes were pressing in from every shadow. Aris felt a cold dread, not just from the words, but from the chilling truth they revealed. The not quite right feeling, the subtle misalignments, the fractured conversations, it was all part of an active, predatory force. A force that was here now in Oakhaven, and perhaps in this very shed. Aris backed away slowly, their gaze sweeping across the cluttered shelves. Every object, every old tool, every stacked crate now seemed to hold a hidden threat. The gaps between them, once just empty space, now felt like hungry mouths. Tiny, invisible fissures pulsed, or so it seemed in the very structure of the shed. Was it just their imagination, fueled by fear and Dr. Vance's desperate warnings, or was the world truly becoming a sieve, with reality leaking through the widening cracks? They stumbled out of the shed, into the damp, cool air of the mountain afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained bruised and gray. Aris took a deep, shaky breath, trying to clear their head, to push away the terrifying implications of the journal. But the words had taken root. The idea of a sentient absence, a void that devoured connection, was a poison seeping into every corner of their perception. What happens when the very space between things becomes the monster? Back in the cabin, Aris tried to find comfort in routine. They picked up their favorite mug, a chipped ceramic piece from a forgotten trip filled with memories. But as their fingers closed around it, the warmth, the familiarity was gone. It felt like a stranger's mug, a cold, heavy piece of clay with no story, no meaning. It was just an object, an isolated, meaningless thing. The connection, the emotional resonance, had simply vanished. This was more insidious than misplacement. This was a deeper severing. It was as if the emotional threads that tied Aris to their belongings, to their past, were being snipped one by one. Their favorite old sweater, usually a source of comfort, now felt like rough, unfamiliar cloth. Their worn-out boots, once an extension of their feet, felt like heavy, foreign weights. Everything was becoming alien. Everything was losing its belonging. Aris tried to recall the name of the author of a book they had just read yesterday. The title was clear, the plot points vivid, but the author's name was a blank, not forgotten but absent, as if the name had never been connected to the book in the first place. This wasn't just memory loss, it was a surgical removal of context, of relationship. Later, trying to prepare a simple meal, Aris found themselves staring at a potato, then a knife, then a cutting board. The sequence, the connection between these objects and the act of cooking felt distant. The steps were there, individual actions, but the flow, the logic that bound them together, was dissolving. It was like trying to read a story where every sentence was on a different page, with no page numbers. What would you do if your own memories, your own understanding of the world, began to fray? What if the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other suddenly felt like a monumental effort, because the connection between foot and ground and moving forward was breaking down? The feeling of disconnection wasn't just internal. Aris noticed it more and more in the physical world. They reached for a light switch, but their fingers seemed to glide over it without purchase, as if the connection between touch and activate was tenuous. It took several attempts, a frustrating, uncanny resistance, before the light finally flickered on. A door, usually opening with a familiar creak, now felt stubborn, heavy, as if the hinges had forgotten their purpose. It wasn't stuck. It just resisted the act of opening, as if the doorness and openness were no longer linked. It was a battle against the very concept of function. Aris went into Oakhaven, seeking some anchor, some normal interaction, but the town seemed to have slipped further into its strange, disconnected rhythm. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Henderson, looked at Aris with a blank stare when asked for milk. His eyes seemed to glide over Aris's face, not quite seeing a person, but a collection of disparate features. Mr. Henderson eventually pointed vaguely towards a shelf, but his gesture felt random, disconnected from the question. It was as if the concept of milk and where to find it had become two separate entities in his mind, unable to connect. Aris felt a chill. The unraveling loom was not just affecting objects, but minds, severing the threads of basic recognition and logic. Aris saw two women on the street, trying to have a conversation. One would speak about her garden, the other would reply about a recipe. They nodded, smiled, but their words were like two parallel lines, never meeting. They were performing the motions of conversation, but the core connection of shared understanding was gone. It was horrifying to witness, a slow-motion collapse of human interaction. Aris felt a growing terror. This wasn't just the townspeople being eccentric. This was a fundamental breakdown. How could a community function if its members couldn't truly connect? If every interaction was just a series of isolated statements, never forming a coherent dialogue? The very essence of community was being devoured. As Aris walked past an old, abandoned house, they caught a flicker in the air. A momentary distortion like heat haze, but cold. A patch of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it, then vanished. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the impression lingered. A fleeting void, a hungry presence in the interstitial spaces, just as Dr. Vance had warned. It was watching. It was feeding. The next day, Aris was back at the dig site, desperate for the familiar grounding of their work. They picked up a fragment of ancient pottery, hoping for that familiar spark of connection, the whisper of history. But as they turned it in their hands, they saw it again. A tiny, almost invisible shimmer, a ripple in the air just above the shard. This time, it lingered a fraction longer. It was like looking through faulty glass, where a piece of the world was briefly missing, replaced by a hungry absence. Aris felt a cold wave wash over them. These weren't just misalignments. These were glimpses of the unraveling loom itself, actively consuming the glue that held reality together, revealing itself in the gaps it created. Aris tried to force the pottery pieces together again, the ones that refused to connect. They pressed, they twisted, they pleaded with the ancient fragments. But the hairline gap remained, an unfillable void between them. It was as if the very concept of fitting had been erased, leaving only two separate, stubbornly isolated entities. The frustration turned to a chilling realization. It wasn't about finding the right angle or the right amount of force. It was about something fundamental. The relationship between the pieces, the very idea of them being from the same whole, was being systematically devoured. How could you piece together a world where the concept of together no longer existed? That evening, back in the cabin, Aris picked up a framed photograph from their bedside table. It was a picture of a loved one, a warm smile, eyes full of life. A reminder of connection, of a world that once made sense. Aris clutched it, seeking comfort, seeking proof that some things remained whole. But as they looked closer, a subtle shift began. The smile, once so natural, started to feel separate. The lips seemed to float, disconnected from the cheeks. The eyes, once so expressive, began to lose their unified form, becoming two distinct, unrelated shapes. The face was fragmenting. The horror was visceral. This wasn't just a picture distorting. This was the unraveling loom attacking the very concept of a unified face, of a recognizable person. The relationships between features were being devoured, leaving behind only isolated elements. The person in the photo was becoming a collage of meaningless parts. Aris dropped the photo, a strangled cry escaping their lips. It landed face down on the rug. They couldn't bear to look at it. The unraveling loom wasn't just breaking things, it was actively consuming the idea of wholeness, the very essence of identity. What would be left of us if our own faces, our own loved ones, became a collection of unrelated parts? The next morning, Aris forced themselves out, drawn by an unsettling intuition. They walked towards the town's small park, where old Mrs. Gable often sat on a bench, feeding pigeons. Mrs. Gable was known for her stories, her vivid memories of Oakhaven's past. Aris hoped to find some comfort in her coherent narrative. Aris approached the bench. Mrs. Gable was there, a handful of birdseed in her trembling hand. A pigeon pecked at her feet. Aris greeted her, asking about the weather. Mrs. Gable looked up, her eyes cloudy, her smile a little too wide, a little too fixed. "Oh, the sky," she began, her voice soft. "Blue and a white cloud, like cotton and a bird, flying up high, so high." She paused, her gaze unfocused. "My son, he liked blue and flying. He flew a plane long ago. A plane, metal and wings, 2 wings." Aris felt a cold knot tighten in their stomach. This wasn't a story. It was a collection of words, nouns, individual concepts. Blue, cloud, sun, plane. Each word was an island, unconnected to the next. Her memory, her narrative, was disintegrating before Aris's eyes. The unraveling loom was devouring not just her past, but the very framework of her mind. "He came home, Mrs. Gable continued, her voice fading. A man, tall and a smile, wide and a uniform, green, a green uniform. Buttons, shiny, many buttons." She looked at Aris, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Who are you? Are you green? Do you have buttons?" Aris felt a wave of nausea. Her memories were not just isolated, they were actively losing their meaning, their context. The man and son were no longer connected. The uniform and home were just separate concepts. The very idea of a story, of a life narrative, was being shredded into meaningless fragments. This was the true horror, not just things breaking, but the very concept of what made them whole, what gave them meaning, being devoured. What if this happened to everyone? What if it happened to Aris? What would be left of a person once their life story became just a jumble of unrelated words? Aris returned to the cabin, the image of Mrs. Gable's disintegrating memory burned into their mind. They tried to write, to record their observations, to impose order on the chaos. But the words on the page seemed to shimmer, to subtly shift. A sentence, once coherent, would appear to have a word floating slightly above the line, disconnected from its neighbors. Their own thoughts were becoming harder to grasp. A clear idea would form, then dissolve into a collection of unrelated concepts. The internal narrative, the very eye that was Aris, felt like it was fraying at the edges. The relentless need for order was battling an insidious force that actively sought to destroy it. One evening, Aris tried to remember a specific moment from their childhood, a happy memory. The image was there, vivid and clear, but the emotions, the feelings of joy and warmth, were gone. It was like watching a silent film, beautiful but utterly devoid of sound or feeling. The connection to the emotion had been severed. This was the unraveling loom at its most cruel, not just taking away objects or memories, but taking away the asterisk meaning asterisk of them, leaving behind empty shells, devoid of context, devoid of emotional resonance. What was a memory without feeling? What was a loved one's face without the connection of love? Aris began to notice the voids more frequently, not just fleeting glimpses, but subtle shifts in the air, distortions in their peripheral vision. A patch of wall would seem to ripple, a shadow would appear to deepen unnaturally, then snap back to normal. It was like the world was breathing, and with each breath, a piece of its coherence was exhaled. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the shed anymore. It was everywhere. The gaps were not just empty spaces. They were the eyes of the unraveling loom, hungry and ever-present, waiting for the perfect moment to devour more. Aris felt like a fly caught in a web, every struggle only tightening the invisible threads. The sound of the wind outside the cabin seemed to change. It wasn't just whistling through the trees, it carried a strange, almost guttural whisper. A sound that seemed to come from the spaces asterisk between asterisk the leaves, from the very air itself. A sound that spoke of hunger, of an endless, consuming absence. Aris pulled the curtains shut, trying to block out the unsettling night, to create a barrier against the encroaching chaos. But the sounds still seeped in, and the feeling of unseen eyes watching from the gaps inside the cabin was even stronger now. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a subtle, unnerving energy. Sleep offered no escape. Aris's dreams became a terrifying landscape of disconnected images, floating limbs, words without sentences, faces without unity. They woke gasping, the cabin feeling vast and empty, the silence heavier than ever before. The horror was not just external, it was seeping into their very subconscious. Aris knew they had to find answers. The journal, Dr. Vance's fate, the ancient ruins, the legends of the unraveling loom, it all pointed to something vast and terrible. But how could they fight a force that devoured connection itself when their own mind was beginning to unravel? The next morning, Aris tried to make coffee. They poured water into the kettle, placed it on the stove. But as they reached for the coffee grounds, their hand hesitated. The jar felt like it was floating, not quite resting on the counter. The gap beneath it seemed to widen, just a fraction, then snap back, but the impression remained. This was the escalation. The phenomena were no longer just subtle. The voids were becoming more frequent, more noticeable, more insistent. They were actively asserting their presence, making the world subtly, horrifyingly unstable. The very ground beneath Aris's feet felt less solid. Aris tried to focus on their breathing, on the simple, connected act of inhaling and exhaling, but even that felt disjointed. The in and the out seemed like separate events, linked by a fragile, almost non-existent thread. The unraveling loom was everywhere, even in the most fundamental processes of life. They looked at their own hands. Their fingers, once so skilled, so precise, now felt like separate entities, only loosely connected to their palm. The skin seemed to ripple, the lines on their hands subtly shifting, refusing to hold their form. Was their own body beginning to unravel? The fear, once a cold dread, now turned into a desperate, clawing panic. Aris needed to find someone, anyone, who still saw the world as whole, someone who could still connect. They had to prove that connection still existed, that the unraveling loom could be fought. Aris burst out of the cabin, almost running towards the town. They needed to speak to someone, to hear a coherent sentence, to see a face that remained whole. They needed to find proof that reality hadn't completely dissolved into a collection of meaningless fragments. But the town seemed eerily quiet, the streets almost empty. They saw a car parked crookedly by the side of the road, its door ajar. No one was inside. Then Aris saw it, a shimmer, larger and more defined than ever before, hovering in the open doorway of the car. It was a patch of pure absence, a void that seemed to suck in the light around it, leaving a cold, dark impression. It pulsed a silent, hungry beat. And then, as Aris watched, horrified, a piece of the car's interior seemed to warp, to dissolve into the void. A seatbelt buckle, once a solid, metallic object, became a shimmering, disconnected outline, then simply disappeared, devoured. The gaps were not just watching, they were actively consuming. Aris stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping their lips. The unraveling loom was not a passive force. It was an active, sentient predator, devouring the very fabric of existence, piece by piece. The car, once a coherent whole, now had a literal absence carved into its side, a gaping, hungry maw where something once was, and it was growing. What happens when the gaps between everything become the monsters themselves? What happens when the world you know, your memories, your loved ones, your very self, are slowly, insidiously devoured, leaving behind only isolated, meaningless fragments? What happens when you realize the unraveling loom has finally found a way to bridge the ultimate gap, and it's coming for you? The void had shown itself, not a shadow, but an absence, a hungry mouth that had swallowed part of a car. Aris stumbled back, the image burned into their mind. The unraveling loom was no longer subtle. It was here, actively consuming the world, piece by piece. What could fight such a thing? The streets of Oakhaven were eerily quiet. People wandered, yes, but aimlessly. Their movements were jerky, uncoordinated. They bumped into each other, offering no apologies, their eyes distant. Their faces were blank, devoid of recognition, like strangers meeting for the first time every time. Aris tried to speak to a woman sitting on a porch. "Good morning," Aris said, their voice trembling slightly. The woman looked up, her gaze passing over Aris's face as if it were a blurred painting. "Sun," she mumbled, "warm, yellow, high." Her words were individual, unconnected. There was no morning, no good. It was worse than before. The basic threads of thought, of communication, were not just fraying, they were severed. People could no longer form coherent sentences, let alone shared ideas. The very concept of conversation was dissolving into a jumble of unrelated terms. Aris felt a cold knot of terror tighten in their stomach. If basic communication was gone, what was left of a community? What was left of humanity? The unraveling loom was not just affecting objects. It was dismantling the very fabric of human connection. Back in the cabin, Aris looked at their reflection in a small mirror. But the face that looked back was subtly wrong. Not distorted, but disconnected. The eyes seemed separate from the nose, the mouth, hidden by the mask, an isolated feature. It was like a face made of unrelated parts. Aris touched their own face, their fingers tracing the lines of their jaw. It felt strange, unfamiliar. The sense of me, of a unified self, was eroding. Their personal history, once a solid narrative, now felt distant, abstract, like someone else's story. They tried to recall a vivid memory from childhood, a warm summer day. The images were there, fragmented. A sunbeam, a specific toy, a laugh. But the connecting thread, the feeling of this was my experience was gone. It was just a collection of unrelated mental snapshots. The void was becoming more apparent in the cabin. The sugar bowl, which had once felt not quite resting, now clearly hovered, a hair's breadth above the counter. It pulsed with a faint, cold shimmer, like a hungry breath. Aris reached out, almost touching it. The air around the bowl was cold, dead. The connection between the bowl and the surface, the very idea of resting, was being actively devoured. It was a visible manifestation of the Unraveling Loom's hunger. A book on the shelf, previously just misplaced, now seemed to float slightly away from its neighbors. Its spine was not just angled, but seemed to detach, almost like a separate object. The concept of being part of a row was dissolving. The horror was escalating. The voids were no longer fleeting glimpses. They were solidifying, becoming a constant, unnerving presence. They were actively causing physical objects to lose context and cohesion, often hovering with an unsettling grace. Aris tried to write in their journal, to record the madness, to impose some order with words. But as the pen moved across the page, the ink seemed to resist, forming letters that looked familiar, yet alien. The words themselves seemed to lose their meaning. A sentence, once written, would appear to Aris as a collection of individual words, each one a separate island. The grammar, the flow, the very idea of meaning derived from their relationship was dissolving. It was like reading a random list of terms. What happens when language itself breaks down? When the shared understanding of words, the very foundation of thought, is devoured? How can you think? How can you communicate when individual letters become isolated symbols? The silence outside was broken by strange sounds. A dog barked, but the sound seemed to come from nowhere, disembodied, with no sense of direction. Then a bird sang, but the song was like a series of individual notes, without rhythm or melody. Sounds were detaching from their sources. The creak of a floorboard might come from the ceiling. A distant car horn would sound as if it was right beside Aris, then vanish. It was an unnerving cacophony of disconnected stimuli, sensory chaos. Aris covered their ears, trying to block out the assault, but the sounds were everywhere, coming from the gaps themselves, from the spaces between things. The Unraveling Loom was not just consuming sight and touch, it was devouring the very concept of coherent sound. Desperate for logic, Aris turned to their scientific data from the dig site. They pulled out notes, charts, measurements. They tried to piece together the ancient pottery fragments, to find patterns, to re-establish cause and effect. But the data itself seemed to resist. A measurement taken one day would subtly contradict a measurement taken the next, even of the same object. The fundamental laws of relation, of consistency, seemed to break down. Nothing was stable. Nothing was connected. Aris tried to fit two pottery shards together again. They had been trying for days. These pieces, definitively from the same vessel, still refused to connect. The gap between them was not physical, it was conceptual. The idea of them fitting was gone. How could a forensic anthropologist, someone who lived to piece together fragments, function in a world where fundamental laws of relation and cause and effect seem to break down? Their life's work, their very purpose, was being undermined. The sense of isolation deepened, not just from others, but from their own past, their own identity. Aris felt like a collection of disjointed experiences, a mind full of unlinked facts. That I was becoming a we, a they, a it. Aris looked at their hands again. The fingers felt like separate entities, only loosely connected to the palm. They tried to clench their fist, but the action felt like a series of disconnected movements, not a single, unified act. The world was becoming a vast, horrifying collage of meaningless, unlinked elements. The unraveling loom was consuming the very glue that held existence together, leaving consciousness trapped in utter, profound isolation. Even the passage of time felt disjointed. Moments didn't flow into each other, they simply existed, then vanished, replaced by another, unrelated moment. The concept of yesterday or tomorrow began to lose its meaning. Aris knew they were losing themselves. The meticulous, order-seeking mind that defined them was being systematically dismantled. The terror was not just what was happening to the world, but what was happening to them. What would you do if your sense of self, your very identity, began to fragment? If your memories became islands and your thoughts just random words? What would be left of you? The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with the presence of the void. It pulsed, unseen, from the corners of the room, from the gaps between the floorboards, from the very air Aris breathed. It was watching, always watching. A faint, cold whisper seemed to emanate from the walls, a sound made of pure absence. It was the hunger of the unraveling loom, a sound that promised ultimate disconnection, ultimate isolation. Aris clutched a beloved keepsake, a small, polished stone given to them by a loved one. It was a tangible link to a past that felt increasingly abstract. They squeezed it, desperate for its familiar solidity, its connection to meaning. But as they held it, a subtle shift began. The stone, once a unified whole, seemed to lose its cohesion, not cracking, not breaking, but subtly, insidiously losing its stoneness. Its color seemed to fade, its texture to blur. Aris watched, horrified, as the edges of the stone began to soften, to lose their definition. It wasn't disintegrating into dust. It was unraveling into its constituent parts, its very form losing its integrity. The connection that made it a stone was vanishing. Then a tiny, almost invisible shimmer appeared within the stone itself. A miniature void, actively devouring the bonds between its molecules, its atoms. It was becoming a collection of unconnected particles, losing its very essence. The stone became ethereal, transparent. It wasn't there, then it was. Then it wasn't. It was like looking at a ghost of an object, a memory of form rather than a solid thing. The horror was in its dissolution into pure, meaningless fragments. Finally, with a soft, almost inaudible sigh, the stone simply dispersed, not into dust, but into its unconnected atoms, invisible to the naked eye. It was gone, devoured. A symbol of Aris's fracturing self, of a world unraveling into nothingness. Aris stared at their empty hand, then at the spot where the stone had been. There was no trace, no dust, no residue, just an absence, a space where something once was, now filled by the hungry void. It was as if the stone had never existed. The memory of the stone, the feeling of its weight, the connection to the loved one who gave it all became fragmented, distant. The unraveling loom was not just destroying objects. It was erasing their very history, their meaning, their context. What happens when even your most cherished keepsakes, your most solid memories, dissolve into meaningless fragments? What happens when the very concept of belonging is devoured, leaving only isolation? Aris felt a scream building in their throat, but no sound came out. Their voice, their very ability to express, felt disconnected from their intention. It was as if the relationship between thought and speech had been severed. The cabin walls seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling reality. The edges of the furniture blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. The floor felt unstable, shifting beneath Aris's feet, as if its connection to the ground was tenuous. Outside, the moon hung in the bruised sky, but its light seemed to fall apart before it reached the ground. It was a collection of individual photons, not a unified beam. The very fabric of light itself was unraveling. The voids pulsed everywhere now, visible to Aris as shimmering distortions, patches of active absence. They were growing, spreading, consuming. They were the eyes, the mouths, the tendrils of the unraveling loom, and they were closing in. Aris knew they had to escape. Not just the cabin, not just Oakhaven, but this reality. But how could you escape something that devoured the very concept of distance, of direction, of outside and inside? They reached for the doorknob, but their hand passed through it, then connected, then slipped. The relationship between hand and knob, between intention and action, was a fragile, dissolving thing. It took immense effort to grasp it. Finally, with a desperate wrench, the door opened. Aris burst out into the night, gasping for air that felt thin, disconnected from their lungs. The world outside was a swirling chaos of fragmented perceptions. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, patches of earth losing their cohesion, momentarily becoming soft, then solid again. Each step was a battle against the dissolution of fundamental connection. Aris looked up at the sky, seeking some anchor, some point of stability. But even the stars were now individual points of light, disconnected from their constellations, floating randomly in the vast, hungry darkness. Then Aris saw it, a vast shimmering distortion in the air directly above the town. It was immense, a gaping maw of pure absence, actively consuming the light, the sound, the very concept of the sky. It pulsed with a terrible, silent hunger. And from that vast, hungry void, something began to descend. Not a monster of flesh and blood, but a monster of pure disconnection. A tendril of shimmering absence, reaching down towards Oakhaven, towards Aris. What would happen when the unraveling loom finally made its ultimate connection and consumed the last thread of your existence? The vast, hungry void above Oakhaven pulsed, and a tendril of shimmering absence began to descend. Aris stumbled, a choked sound caught in their throat. This was no metaphor. This was real. A monster of pure disconnection, reaching for the town, for them. What do you do when the sky itself becomes a predator? The tendril was not physical, not made of matter. It was a ripple in reality, a tear in the fabric of connection. As it drew closer, the air grew cold, dead. It was the breath of the unraveling loom, exhaling profound nothingness. Aris felt a primal, gut-wrenching fear. A nearby lamppost, usually solid, began to shimmer. Its light flickered, not failing, but dissolving into individual photons, disconnected from the bulb. The pole itself seemed to lose its cohesion, its metal edges blurring. The tendril hadn't even touched it yet, but its influence was already devouring the concept of lamppost. Aris finally accepted it. The unraveling loom was an active, sentient force. It wasn't just happening, it was asterisk being done asterisk. A predatory entity feeding on the very glue that held existence together. It was here, and it was hungry. Oakhaven was no longer a town, it was a terrifying carrelage. Houses floated slightly above their foundations. Trees had branches that didn't quite connect to their trunks. Cars sat on streets, but their wheels hovered inches away. Everything was a non sequitur, a jumble of unlinked elements. People moved through this broken world, their faces blank, their movements disjointed. They bumped into each other, their gazes sliding past without recognition. Each person was an island, adrift in a sea of utter disconnection. Their very presence was a haunting testament to the loom's power. Aris, driven by their desperate need for order, tried to create connection. They found two loose bricks from a crumbled wall and attempted to bind them with a piece of twine. They pulled the knot tight, a desperate plea for cohesion. But as soon as the knot was tied, the twine stretched unnaturally, then dissolved into shimmering dust. The bricks, once briefly touching, now repelled each other, floating apart. The concept of binding was devoured. Aris's efforts were futile. Then the whisper came, not from outside, but from within Aris's own mind. A cold, insidious voice made of pure absence. It spoke of meaninglessness, of cosmic isolation, of the ultimate futility of all connection. Aris clutched their head, a silent scream building. The whisper was not words, but a crushing sensation, a profound weight of utter non-existence. It promised a world where no two things could truly relate, where every thought, every memory, every sensation was an island without shore. It was the voice of the loom, devouring Aris's sanity. Back at the cabin, Aris frantically gathered pottery shards. The familiar fragments, once a source of comfort, now felt like a challenge. They tried to piece together a simple vessel, their hands moving with desperate precision, ignoring the loom's whisper. They pressed two pieces together, they held, for a second, then a subtle shiver. The pieces vibrated, then slowly, insidiously separated, not breaking, but simply losing their bond, as if the concept of whole had been erased. The vessel remained a collection of fragments. Outside, the town continued its descent into disunity. A child's tricycle lay abandoned, but its wheels floated a few inches from the frame, spinning slowly in the air. A toy, once a coherent object, was now just a collection of unlinked parts. The sounds were worse. A dog barked, but the sound seemed to come from the sky. A car horn blared, but the sound was sharp, cut off, with no sense of distance or direction. Everything was a disconnected auditory event, a sensory assault. Aris saw an old man, Mr. Abernathy, sitting on a bench. He was known for his long, rambling stories of Oakhaven's past. Aris approached, hoping for a flicker of narrative. But as Mr. Abernathy spoke, a shimmering void appeared at his temple, subtly pulling at his mind. He spoke of water, then fish, then grandfather, then war. Each word was clear, but utterly without context, without link. His life story, his very identity, was being devoured, leaving behind only empty vessels of concepts. Mr. Abernathy was becoming a ghost of himself. The horror was not just what was being taken, but what was left behind. A shell, a collection of meaningless parts. Aris felt a cold dread. If memories could be devoured, what protected their own? What protected *U*? The whisper in Aris's mind grew stronger, clearer. It was the unraveling loom, communicating directly. It gloated. It revealed its truth. It grew stronger with each severed bond, each broken connection. Disunity was its nourishment. Every fracture, every lost memory, every dissolving object fueled the loom. It fed on the absence of relationship, gorging itself on the very concept of together. It was a parasitic entity, growing fat on the world's unraveling. Desperate, Aris tried to call a loved one, a single, tangible connection to a world that still made sense. They picked up the old landline phone in the cabin, their fingers fumbling with the receiver. They dialed the number, each digit a desperate prayer. The line crackled, then silence. No dial tone, no connection. The phone itself seemed to lose its purpose, becoming a dead weight in Aris's hand. The outside world was truly gone. The cabin felt vast, empty. Aris was utterly alone. The silence pressed in, no longer peaceful, but a heavy blanket of profound isolation. The loom had severed the last thread to their past, to anyone who might understand. What do you do when you are truly, cosmically alone? Aris walked to the small, cracked window pane. They looked at their reflection, but it was wrong. Not distorted, but fractured. Two distinct images, subtly misaligned. A mind grappling with two separate, unconnected realities. One reflection held the coherent, meticulous Aris, the anthropologist of order. The other was a blurred, dissolving image, already succumbing to the fragmentation. The loom was tearing at their very self, creating a schism within their own mind. The psychological toll was immense. Aris felt their thoughts fraying, their internal narrative dissolving. The meticulous order seeker was battling a force that sought to dismantle the very concept of self. The effort was exhausting, terrifying. The loom's whisper intensified. It was a chorus of silent voices, all speaking of nothingness, of the sweet release of non-connection. It promised an end to the burden of coherence, the peace of utter meaninglessness. It was trying to break Aris's will. Oakhaven's infrastructure continued its unraveling. A paved road outside the cabin had sections that floated, disconnected from the earth. Power lines hung limp, their wires dissolving into shimmering strands. The town was losing its physical integrity. Aris approached a small wooden bridge over a dried-up stream. The planks of the bridge were subtly separating, creating tiny, shimmering gaps between them. The very concept of crossing was becoming impossible. The bridge was no longer a bridge. They found a broken wooden chair in the cabin, two pieces clearly meant to fit. Aris picked them up, hoping to prove the loom wrong, to show that connection could still be forged. They tried to press the jagged edges together, but the wood resisted. The edges shimmered, dissolving into thin air as they neared. The concept of repair was gone. The pieces refused to bond, becoming only two separate, meaningless fragments. Aris dropped them in despair. Time itself began to break down. Moments didn't flow, they simply existed, then vanished, replaced by another, unrelated moment. Aris looked at a clock. Its hands spun wildly, then froze, then spun again. The concept of now was meaningless. Aris's own sense of identity continued to erode. They struggled to remember their full name, their profession, their purpose. That I was dissolving into a collection of unlinked facts, a ghost of a person. What would be left when Aris was gone? Outside, a tree stood, but its leaves were detaching from the branches, not falling, but floating aimlessly in the air. Each leaf was an island, disconnected from its source, from the tree's life. Nature itself was unraveling. A small stream, once flowing, now moved as individual, disconnected droplets of water hovering in the air. The concept of flow, of current, was gone. The water was no longer a whole, but a collection of unrelated parts. The gaps were everywhere now, not just shimmering absences, but active, hungry entities. They floated in the air, subtly moving towards objects, nibbling at their edges, consuming small pieces. They were becoming more aggressive, more visible. Aris tried to write in their journal, to record the madness, to capture a single coherent thought. But as the pen moved, the ink on the page behind it subtly faded, or the letters became disjointed. The act of writing was becoming meaningless. The horrifying realization struck Aris. The loom wasn't just breaking things, it was erasing the asterisk concept of relationship itself. It was devouring the very glue that allowed things to connect, to have meaning, to exist as a whole. It was a terror beyond comprehension. The town square was a scene of utter disunity. Masked people wandered aimlessly, their paths never intersecting, their eyes vacant. Each person was a universe unto themselves, utterly disconnected, no shared space, no shared purpose. It was a nightmare of isolation. Aris saw what looked like a family, a masked woman, a masked child. They stood close, but looked in opposite directions. Their hands hovered near each other, but never quite touched. A shimmering void pulsed subtly between them, devouring their bond. The child held a small toy car. As Aris watched, horrified, the toy began to shimmer. Its wheels detached, its body fragmented, dissolving into shimmering dust in the child's hands. The child looked at it, confused, but without deep emotion. The masked mother observed the dissolving toy with a blank, empty expression. Her eyes were distant, her face devoid of emotion. Her own memories of the child, of their connection, were clearly eroding. She was becoming an empty vessel. The whisper from the loom now filled Aris's entire mind, a deafening chorus of cosmic isolation. It was no longer a suggestion, but a command, demanding the surrender of all coherence, all connection. Aris clutched their head, fighting for sanity. The loom's message was clear, chilling. There is no us. There is no we. Only I, isolated, meaningless, fleeting. It was the ultimate attack on shared existence, on humanity itself. What would be left when there was no us? Aris's mind fought back, a desperate struggle against the encroaching disunity. The order seeker, the rebuilder of fragments, refused to surrender. But the effort was tearing them apart, a war within their own consciousness. They looked into the puddle again. Their reflection was no longer fractured, but two completely separate images, each looking in a different direction, utterly disconnected. The schism was complete. Aris was two distinct, unlinked entities. The loom's tendrils were everywhere now, shimmering, dark, reaching. They moved through the air, actively devouring pieces of buildings, trees, the very ground. They were the active agents of the loom, consuming reality at an alarming pace. Aris looked down at their own hand. It was visibly fragmenting. Their fingers were separating, blurring at the edges, becoming semi-transparent. Their skin rippled, losing its cohesion. Their own body was becoming a collection of unlinked parts. Panic, raw and animalistic, seized Aris, not just for the world, but for themselves. Their identity, their very physical form, was being devoured. They clutched their chest, a desperate attempt to hold themselves together, to stop the unraveling. The loom's whisper echoed its final, chilling message. You are next. Your essence, your thoughts, your very self, all will be devoured, all will be unlinked, and nothing will remain. Aris stood amidst a swirling vortex of shimmering absence. What happens when your own body becomes a collection of disconnected cells? When your mind is a jumble of unlinked thoughts? When the very I that defines you is consumed? What happens when the unraveling loom finally devours the last thread of your existence, leaving behind only the terrifying, silent peace of ultimate nothingness? The loom's whisper echoed its final, chilling message. You are next. Aris looked down, their own hand visibly fragmenting. Fingers blurred at the edges, becoming semi-transparent. Their skin rippled, losing its cohesion. Was this how it ended? Their very form dissolving. Panic, raw and animalistic, seized Aris, not just for the world, but for themselves. Their identity, their physical form, was being devoured. They clutched their chest, a desperate attempt to hold themselves together, to stop the unraveling. What happens when your body betrays you? The loom's tendrils were everywhere now, shimmering, dark, reaching. They moved through the air, actively devouring pieces of buildings, trees, the very ground. Aris felt their own thoughts fraying, their internal narrative dissolving. The meticulous order-seeker was battling a war within. The whisper from the loom now filled Aris's entire mind, a deafening chorus of cosmic isolation. It was no longer a suggestion, but a command, demanding the surrender of all coherence, all connection. Aris clutched their head, fighting for sanity. Could you resist such a voice? Aris fought against complete psychological disintegration. Their thoughts, once a clear stream, were now a broken dam, individual concepts crashing against each other. They struggled to understand the loom's true nature, to name the enemy that consumed meaning. The loom's message was clear. There is no us, there is no we, only I, isolated, meaningless, fleeting. It was the ultimate attack on shared existence. Aris felt the burden of coherence, the monstrousness of absence, pressing in from all sides. Aris theorized, the loom was not just a void, but an entity of pure absence, an anti-thread devouring reality's underlying glue. It didn't destroy, it unmade asterisk. It took the concept of connection, leaving only its opposite. What could be more terrifying than that? The horror of this anti-existence was profound. It wasn't about missing pieces. It was about the idea of piecing together being eaten. Aris's very purpose, their life's work as a forensic anthropologist, was marked by this entity. The loom fed on the absence of relationship, gorging itself on the very concept of together. Every fracture, every lost memory, every dissolving object fueled it. Disunity was its nourishment. Aris felt their own internal connections weakening, a terrifying echo of the world's fate. But a spark of defiance flickered within Aris. The desperate need to find order, to prove that even the most shattered remnants could be reconnected, was still alive. They refused to surrender to the chaos, to the weaponization of disconnection. Aris knew they couldn't fight the loom with conventional means. It was a conceptual entity. It needed a conceptual weapon. A desperate experiment formed in their mind to create a new, forced narrative of connection using pure intention, pure will. They chose two simple objects: a smooth river stone and a dried leaf. Two things utterly unrelated, yet now Aris would try to bind them, not with twine, but with the sheer force of their mind, with an overwhelming intention of connection. Aris closed their eyes, focusing every ounce of their being. They imagined the atoms of the stone and the leaf reaching out, interlocking, becoming one. They poured their desperate need for unity into the space between them. Connect, they willed, be one. But the loom was listening. The air between Aris's hands grew cold, heavy, a shimmering void, a patch of pure absence, pulsed between the stone and the leaf. It actively pushed against Aris's intention, a silent, powerful repulsion. The void directly attacked. The leaf, instead of connecting, began to subtly curl away from the stone, as if recoiling from an unseen force. The stone felt heavier, denser, more isolated than before. Aris's desperate attempt was met with the loom's cold, active resistance. The concept of unity was being devoured. The void then directly attacked Aris's ability to connect thoughts. A clear idea would form, then dissolve into a collection of unrelated concepts. The internal narrative, the very eye that was Aris, felt like it was fraying at the edges. The loom was disarming them from within. Memories became isolated fragments. Aris tried to recall a specific detail from a childhood memory, and the image was there, vivid and clear. But the emotions, the feelings of joy and warmth, were gone. It was like watching a silent film, beautiful but utterly devoid of sound or feeling. The connection to the emotion had been severed. Their specialized skills, their renowned ability to piece together fragments, were now useless. Aris tried to reassemble ancient pottery shards, but the pieces mocked them, refusing to bond. It wasn't about finding the right angle. It was about the idea of fitting together being erased. The loom's whisper intensified, gloating. It revealed its truth. It grew stronger with each severed bond, each broken connection. Disunity was its nourishment. It consumed the very glue that held existence together, leaving consciousness trapped in utter, profound isolation. Aris looked at their reflection in a puddle. It was no longer fractured, but two completely separate images, each looking in a different direction, utterly disconnected. The schism was complete. Aris was two distinct, unlinked entities. What would be left when Aris was gone? The psychological toll was immense. The order seeker, the rebuilder of fragments, refused to surrender, but the effort was tearing them apart, a war within their own consciousness. Aris knew they needed a stronger weapon, something ancient, something beyond pure will. An unsettling intuition pulled Aris back to the dig site. The ancient ruins, the source of the initial unraveling, might also hold the key to fighting it. Perhaps something lay buried, a symbol of unity, a forgotten defense against the loom's hunger. The dig site was worse than before. Ancient stones floated inches above their foundations. Shards of pottery lay scattered, each one a universe unto itself, refusing to acknowledge its neighbors. The very concept of sight was barely holding together. Aris moved with a strange, disjointed rhythm, their body battling its own fragmentation. They began to search, not for artifacts, but for a feeling, a resonance. Their anthropologist's instinct, though frayed, still guided them. The air in the ruins was thick with the loom's presence, a cold, silent pressure. The gaps pulsed everywhere, watching, waiting for Aris to falter, to lose their last thread of coherence. It was like walking through a living, hungry darkness. Aris felt a faint pull, a subtle warmth amidst the pervasive coldness. It came from a rarely excavated section, a place where the earth still held some semblance of cohesion. They began to dig, their hands moving with renewed, desperate purpose. The loom resisted. The earth around Aris's hands seemed to stiffen, refusing to yield. The shovel felt disconnected from their grip, its blade blurring. It was actively fighting their attempt to uncover anything that might challenge its reign of disunity. But Aris persisted, driven by a desperate, almost primal need to connect, to find something, anything, that defied the loom's hunger. They dug deeper, sweat beading on their brow, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The struggle was physical, mental, existential. Then their fingers brushed against something hard, smooth, and oddly warm. Not stone, not pottery. It felt ancient, yet vibrant. A faint hum resonated through their fingertips, a sound of profound, undeniable unity. What was this artifact? Aris carefully unearthed it. It was a disc, about the size of their palm, made of a dark, unknown metal. Etched into its surface was a complex, interlocking pattern, a symbol of perfect, inherent unity. Every line flowed into the next, every curve connected. It was the antithesis of the loom. The symbol seemed to thrum with ancient power, a silent song of coherence in a world of discord. Aris felt a surge of desperate hope. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a conceptual anchor, a physical representation of everything the loom devoured. This symbol, buried deep within the ruins, was a testament to an ancient understanding. Perhaps those who built these structures knew of the loom, knew of its hunger, and crafted this as a shield, a weapon of ultimate connection. Could it work? Aris clutched the symbol, its warmth a stark contrast to the loom's cold. They knew what they had to do. They would project a powerful intention of connection through this symbol, a last plea for coherence, a desperate battle against the encroaching disunity. They found a high point in the ruins, a crumbling altar that still held some residual power. The air here was thinner, the loom's presence less crushing. Aris stood, the symbol held aloft, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Aris closed their eyes, focusing on the symbol's intricate patterns. They imagined every line, every curve, extending outwards, weaving new threads of connection, mending the unraveling world. They poured their entire being into this act of will. The loom roared, not with sound, but with a crushing wave of pure absence. The air around Aris turned frigid, then impossibly hot. The very fabric of reality seemed to scream in protest. The symbol was working. It was challenging the loom directly. Aris felt their own mental fragments trying to pull away, the loom's counterattack tearing at their mind. But the symbol grounded them, its inherent unity a shield against the psychological onslaught. They would not break, not yet. The world around them shifted. For a fleeting moment, The fragmented stones of the altar seemed to knit back together. A faint, almost imperceptible hum of coherence filled the air. The loom's unraveling was momentarily halted, even reversed. Could it be? But this act drew the full, terrifying attention of the unraveling loom. The sky above Oakhaven, already bruised, began to darken further, not with clouds, but with a vast, consuming darkness that seemed to swallow the stars themselves. It was a living shadow. From the center of this cosmic maw, a new tendril descended, not shimmering and subtle like before, but immense, opaque, and terrifyingly solid. It was a colossal column of pure, concentrated absence, reaching directly for Aris, for the symbol. The ground trembled. Buildings in Oakhaven groaned, their remaining connections snapping with sharp, sickening sounds. The world was screaming, tearing itself apart in the face of this ultimate manifestation of the loom. What would you do in the face of such power? The air around Aris became a vortex of cold and heat, of pressure and emptiness. The whisper of the loom was now a deafening, silent roar, promising utter annihilation, the ultimate disunion. It was coming for them, for the last thread of coherence. Aris clutched the symbol, its light now struggling against the encroaching darkness. They focused all their remaining will, all their desperate need for connection, into its ancient patterns. This was it, the final stand against the unraveling loom. The colossal tendril of absence descended faster, a silent, hungry maw opening wide above them. It was not just consuming light, it was consuming the very concept of space, of distance, of above and below. It was the end of all geometry. Aris felt their own body begin to dissolve again, faster now, their limbs blurring, their senses detaching. The loom was reaching into their very essence, trying to unravel their mind, their identity, their connection to existence itself. They were being pulled apart. But Aris held firm, their eyes, visible above the mask, burning with a fierce, desperate light. The symbol of unity pulsed, a tiny star against a growing, cosmic night. They would not let it take everything. They would not let it win. The loom's tendril touched the altar, not with impact, but with a silent, consuming touch. The ancient stone did not shatter, it simply ceased to be. It dissolved into pure absence, leaving a gaping, hungry maw in its place. The world was being erased. Aris stood at the edge of this growing void, the symbol a tiny, defiant ember. The loom was here, fully manifested, a vast, consuming darkness that stretched from the heavens to the earth. It was the ultimate monster, the devourer of all that connects. The final battle for coherence had begun. Aris, a single, fragmented human with a desperate need for order, faced an entity that consumed the very concept of relationship. This was not just about saving Oakhaven, it was about saving reality itself. What would be left? What happens when the ultimate predator of connection finally manifests its full, terrifying power? When the very concept of together is under direct assault? What happens when you, a fragment of a fragment, must face the monstrous absence that seeks to devour the last thread of your existence and all existence? We will find out. The colossal tendril of pure absence descended. It was no longer a shimmering distortion, but a solid, terrifying column of nothingness, tearing at the very concept of the sky. Aris, clutching the symbol of unity, felt the world scream around them. What do you do when the universe itself begins to unravel? The ground beneath Aris bucked and tore. Buildings in Oakhaven groaned, their remaining connections snapping with sharp, sickening sounds. Not just physical breaks, but the very idea of holding together was being devoured. The world was tearing itself apart, a horrifying symphony of disunion. The air around Aris became a vortex of cold and heat, of crushing pressure and absolute emptiness. The loom's whisper was now a deafening, silent roar, promising utter annihilation, the ultimate disunion. It was coming for them, for the last thread of coherence, for the symbol. Aris clutched the symbol, its light now a struggling ember against the encroaching darkness. They focused all their remaining will, all their desperate need for connection, into its ancient patterns. This was it, the final stand against the unraveling loom. Their mind fought to hold onto a single, coherent thought. The colossal tendril of absence descended faster. It was not just consuming light, it was devouring the very concept of space, of distance, of above and below. It was the end of all geometry, all perspective. The world flattened into a meaningless plane. Aris felt their own body begin to dissolve again, faster now. Their limbs blurred, their senses detached. The loom was reaching into their very essence, trying to unravel their mind, their identity, their connection to existence itself. They were being pulled apart, atom by atom. But Aris held firm, their visible eyes burning with a fierce, desperate light above the mask. The symbol of unity pulsed, a tiny star against a growing, cosmic night. They would not let it take everything. They would not let it win. Not yet. The loom's tendril touched the altar, not with impact, but with a silent, consuming touch. The ancient stone did not shatter, it simply ceased to be. It dissolved into pure absence, leaving a gaping, hungry maw in its place. The world was being erased, piece by horrifying piece. Aris stood at the edge of this growing void, the symbol a tiny, defiant ember. The loom was here, fully manifested, a vast, consuming darkness that stretched from the heavens to the earth. It was the ultimate monster, the devourer of all that connects. The final battle for coherence had begun. The symbol of unity began to shimmer. Its intricate patterns, once so perfectly interlocking, started to blur. A faint, cold light pulsed from within it, struggling against the loom's pervasive darkness. Was Aris's last hope failing? Was the very concept of unity being devoured? The loom's silent roar intensified. It was a pressure directly on Aris's mind, a force seeking to dismantle their thoughts, to sever the connections between their memories. A childhood image, once vivid, became a collection of floating, unrelated colors. The terror was absolute. The edges of the symbol began to fray, not breaking, but losing their definition, their cohesion. It was as if the very idea of its unity was being erased, leaving behind only meaningless lines and curves. Aris felt a profound chill, a cold dread seeping into their bones. The loom was actively consuming the symbol's power, its conceptual integrity. It was devouring the very grammar of connection that the symbol represented. Aris felt its warmth fading, replaced by the loom's cold, hungry presence. The shield was weakening. Aris tried to focus on a single memory, a coherent thought, anything to resist the loom's mental assault. But the effort was monumental. Words floated in their mind, disconnected from sentences. Images appeared, then dissolved without context. The internal narrative was collapsing. The symbol of unity flickered, then dimmed significantly. A piece of its metal surface, where an intricate line once connected, simply vanished, leaving a tiny, perfect absence. The loom was winning. The very concept of unity was being systematically unmade. Aris felt a wave of despair. Their desperate need for order, for connection, was being marked, devoured. The symbol, their last hope, was failing. What could fight an entity that consumed the very idea of coherence? What was left? The loom's whisper filled Aris's mind, no longer a roar, but a calm, chilling certainty. Resistance is futile. Coherence is a burden. Embrace the peace of uncreation. It promised an end to the struggle, a release into ultimate meaninglessness. The symbol, once warm, was now cold and inert in Aris's hand. Its glowing patterns were gone, replaced by a dull, mottled surface. It was just a disk of metal again, disconnected from its purpose, its power devoured. The last thread was broken. Aris looked at their own hands. The fingers were visibly separating, blurring at the edges, becoming semi-transparent. Their skin rippled, losing its cohesion. Their own body was becoming a collection of unlinked parts, just like the world around them. The loom's tendril was almost upon them, a vast, hungry maw of pure absence. Aris felt their very self being pulled apart, their identity dissolving into a collection of unlinked sensations. What was left when Aris was gone? What was left of anyone? A horrifying, desperate thought formed in Aris's mind. The symbol had failed. Direct resistance was useless. To understand the loom, truly understand it, they had to become like it. To sacrifice their own coherence, their sense of self, to gain insight. It was an act of ultimate surrender, a monstrous gamble. To let go of the very thing they cherished most, order, connection, their unified self. To embrace fragmentation, to willingly become a collection of unlinked parts, to see through the loom's eyes. Aris made the choice. They released their grip on their own mental cohesion, on the desperate need to connect. They opened their mind to the loom's influence, inviting the disunity, welcoming the unraveling. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown. The loom's tendril paused, hovering inches above Aris. It sensed the shift, the surrender. The silent roar subsided, replaced by a profound, hungry anticipation. It was waiting, watching Aris embrace its nature. A terrifying, silent communion. Aris felt their identity dissolve, not painfully, but like a sandcastle washing away in the tide. Memories, thoughts, emotions, they all separated, becoming individual, unlinked particles. The I that was Aris ceased to exist as a unified entity. And then they saw, not with eyes, but with a new, horrifying perception. The loom was not a monster of malice, but a fundamental force, an entity of ultimate entropy, a simplification to pure, unlinked components. It was the universe's ultimate uncreator. It didn't destroy, it merely reduced. It stripped away context, relationship, meaning, leaving behind only raw, isolated existence. A single atom, a single thought, a single color, each a universe unto itself, with no connection to any other. The loom was the monstrousness of absence, an active force that devoured the very glue that held reality together. Its hunger was not for destruction, but for ultimate simplification, for a world where no two things could truly relate. Aris understood its terrible logic. Connection was a burden. Coherence was an illusion. The loom offered the ultimate peace, the cessation of all relationship, the end of all meaning. a profound, cosmic isolation where nothing mattered because nothing was linked. They saw the universe as the loom saw it, a vast, horrifying collage of meaningless, unlinked elements. Every star, every planet, every living being, each an island, utterly disconnected, floating in an infinite, silent void. This was the ultimate truth. Aris experienced ultimate, profound isolation. They perceived themselves as a single, unconnected point in this infinite, meaningless void. There was no past, no future, no other beings. Just I, a singular, fleeting sensation without context or relation. Their body, their mind, their very identity, all had dissolved into a collection of unlinked components. There was no Aris as they once knew it, only a perception, a singular point of consciousness floating in an ocean of uncreation. The terror was not of pain, but of absolute aloneness. No echo, no reflection, no touch. Just the stark, unyielding reality of being a single, isolated element with no possibility of connection, no meaning to its existence. What would you do if you were the last coherent thought in an unlinked universe? If your own hand felt like a stranger's, your own memories like fragments of someone else's dream, what would you do if you were truly, cosmically alone? Even the passage of time had dissolved. There was no then or now, just an eternal, unchanging present, a succession of unlinked moments that held no narrative, no flow. Aris was trapped in a timeless, meaningless existence. Aris, the forensic anthropologist, the rebuilder of fragments, had become the ultimate fragment. An isolated consciousness, existing solely to perceive the horror of a world where nothing connected, where unity was a forgotten dream. And in this terrifying, absolute isolation, a terrible new coherence began to form, not the coherence of connection, but the very grammar of absence and uncreation. Aris began to understand the loom's language, its internal logic. They saw the underlying rules of disunity, the fundamental principles of fragmentation. The loom was not chaos, it was a different kind of order, an order of ultimate simplicity, of pure, unlinked components. A horrifying, perfect system. Aris now understood the monstrousness of absence as an active force. It was not just emptiness, it was a consuming intelligence, a pervasive environmental anomaly that actively metabolized the fundamental relationships and connections between all things. They perceived the gaps not as voids, but as active, hungry entities, the eyes and mouths of the loom, constantly feeding, constantly expanding. The interstitial spaces were alive, sentient, and eternally consuming the glue of existence. Aris, the ultimate order seeker, had found a terrible new order, the order of disunity, the coherence of fragmentation. They were no longer fighting the loom, they were observing it, understanding it, from within its terrible embrace. This was the twisted closure, not victory, not escape, but a profound, horrifying understanding. Aris was still there, but not as they were. They were a singular point of awareness, eternally observing the horror of absolute disconnection. The loom's tendril, now fully descended, had consumed the entire town of Oakhaven. Not a trace remained. Just a vast, circular expanse of pure absence, a perfectly empty hole in the world where meaning once was. And Aris was at its center. They were the sole, isolated consciousness in an unlinked universe, a silent witness to the loom's eternal work. Their mind, once so desperate for connection, now understood and accepted the profound, terrifying peace of ultimate disunion. What would it be like to perceive only fragments, to understand the logic of meaninglessness, to be the last, isolated observer in a world where nothing connects, where every object, every memory, every thought is an island unto itself? Aris's understanding was absolute. The loom was everywhere, in the spaces between atoms, between thoughts, between moments. It was the fundamental truth, now fully revealed, and Aris was its eternal, silent observer, forever trapped in profound isolation. No hope, no relief, only the perpetual dread of knowing, of seeing the world as a collection of unlinked components. The burden of coherence was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of absolute, unyielding incoherence. Aris, the reclusive anthropologist, who sought to piece together fragments, was now a fragment themselves. Their desperate need for order had led them to the ultimate disorder, and to an understanding far more terrifying than any chaos. The loom had won, not through destruction, but through uncreation. It had devoured the very concept of relationship, leaving behind a universe of isolated elements, eternally observed by a single, fragmented consciousness. The silence was absolute. And sometimes, on a quiet night, when the world seems a little too still, a little too disconnected, don't you feel it? That subtle tremor beneath the surface of everything, that whisper that things aren't quite as solid as they seem. What if the gaps in your own reality are beginning to watch you too?